What up, friends? I'm James, your host, and today we're going to be reviewing Kendrick Lamar's newest album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. This is the fifth studio album by American rapper Kendrick Lamar. It's also the long-awaited project by Kendrick after 2017's Damn, a 5-year gap between albums. Kendrick has genre-defining albums behind him, like Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly. I gotta be honest though, Damn was a disappointment, and I was a bit worried to see the direction that Kendrick would go in with his following albums. While Mr. Morale doesn't exactly recapture the power behind those genre-defining albums that I mentioned previously, I was happy to see a bit more of Kendrick's experimental style return. This is essentially a therapy session in album form, and like most therapy sessions, the quality is a bit rocky. However, I do think the album overall comes out on top. The opening track, United in Grief, is definitely one of my favorites on the record, with its operatic opening to the piano-focused beat and delivery, and just the general energy that it has. It's jazzy and experimental at the same time. I actually kind of wish the entire album went in this direction, but oh well. The emphasis on the drums in this track is really cool, and it's also pretty interesting to see Kendrick try to match these drum patterns in his flows. There's a lot of variety on here because of it. In the song, he examines his life up until this point, alongside what it even means to be a rapper in the first place, and I think his I Grieve Different line showcases the amount of growth and how his perspectives have changed throughout his career and his life. N95 is one of the bangers on the album, but I think it does its job well. It's a melodic yet hard-hitting tune, mixing these elegant pianos with these triumphant synths. It's fitting for the message of the track, depicting a bunch of rappers and their flex-heavy lifestyle, but how it's ultimately all superficial in the end. Growth as a person is a really big theme on this record, and I think this track largely showcases how when you take away a lot of people's designer, their jewelry, their wealth, what have you, they end up being not exactly the most interesting or the best people. The next track, Worldwide Steppers, is I think kind of halfway there to being a great song. It's an interesting topic, criticizing the sort of moralistic gatekeepers that act high and mighty when in fact everybody is a problematic and flawed person to some degree. It also showcases some of Kendrick's struggles in regards to race, like how when he hooks up with white women, he has this like nagging feeling at the back of his head that his ancestors are looking down upon him in shame for obvious reasons. I feel like these are interesting topics individually, however, combining them together in one song makes them feel not as fleshed out as they could have if they were both two separate tracks. I also find the instrumental on this one to be pretty basic and mundane. It doesn't really change throughout the track's runtime, and it's just not really engaging to begin with. Die Hard is another one of my favorites, taking a bit more of a melodic and soulful approach here. The general groove on this thing is super chill and catchy, and I'm really digging Amanda Reifer's post-chorus on here especially. It's pretty cool to see Kendrick have these smoother flows and a very grounded and vulnerable cadence on this track. It's also a fairly simple message, but a fairly effective one as well, with him finding it hard to open up to people, especially his partner, and just love them. But I think the line, "I got some regrets, but my past won't keep me from my best," is him trying to better himself. The subtle piano and brass samples also match the tone of this track really well. Father Time is literally one of the most therapy session-esque songs on here, and it's a great one. It almost feels like a Kanye beat at times with the distorted vocal samples and the very soulful piano-driven backbone. It is the perfect backdrop, though, to Kendrick sort of lamenting about how his past and his trauma growing up led him to become the person that he is today. It also showcases how these experiences growing up led to a lot of the problems and trauma that he still goes through. Specifically, it examines the effect on toxic masculinity and absent fathers on homes in the black community. This is a pretty powerful topic for the genre, rejecting the hyper-masculine aspects of it in many ways, and instead embracing emotional vulnerability. I will say, though, that Rich Spirit is an example of the record at its weakest. When we're not getting the more experimental or jazzy beats, we get these bland trap rap-oriented instrumentals that really stick out among the rest of the songs on the record as being pretty uninteresting. This one isn't the worst, but it's just boring, with a very simple and bass-driven beat, alongside Kendrick's very breathy and quiet flows. I can appreciate the lyrics here, with him trying to essentially stand strong against the mindless hate that's directed towards him, but like, damn, you think he could have gotten a more aggressive beat, or at least more of a sort of soulful and melancholic one? I don't know, but just this one doesn't have the power to back up the lyrics, I think. We Cry Together is a very bold song for Kendrick, I have to say. It's almost not even a song, it's more of like a slam poetry outing, but I do think it really works for this album's narrative. The Florence and the Machine sample makes for a great intro, and the contrast between Kendrick and Taylor Page's arguing over a very melancholic and piano-driven instrumental is fantastic. Somehow, Kendrick got outperformed on his own song because Taylor just put everything she had into this song. She combined every single stage of grief into one and maybe even created a new one. It's pretty intense. Their dynamic is believable and well done, and while the subject matter of their argument is shallow, I feel like it's kind of the point, as how most arguments just stem from you not listening to your partner, and how a lot of the arguments start over something trivial to begin with, but they spiral into something more and more intense. Purple Hearts marks the end of disc 1 of the record overall, and it's a pretty well crafted one. It's a great downcast beat with a bit of an electro spin to it. It's jazzy and chill, but it has a punch to it that helps back up the weight of the lyrics. Kendrick's chorus is also very melodic and fits the lush production style that we got going on here. The lyrics specifically are kind of a continuation of the love themes, with Kendrick taking a step back and really honing in and focusing on his home and love life. Summer Walker provides a good verse and is also a great support to Kendrick's vocals. It's also about understanding your partner, which is where I think Summer Walker's verse really comes into shine, as getting her perspective, a woman's perspective on the relationship, is a very welcome approach, especially coming off of the last track. Ghostface adds some hype to the track while also helping showcase Kendrick's thoughts and views on spirituality, his relationship with religion in general, really, as while he still finds himself faithful, he has these sort of wavering doubts and struggles with his beliefs as he sees the suffering throughout the world. Count Me Out starts disc 2 of the project, calling back to United in Grief with the vocal sample leading its intro. I like the first third of this track with its very soulful instrumental and Kendrick's smooth flows, but the rest of the track really kills it for me. After the chorus, the beat becomes painfully bland with these skeletal 808s, isolated keys, and a fuzzy bass line. The lyrics are also kind of underwhelming on this one, feeling very surface level, and a lot of these were already covered on other tracks in the record too. The vocal delivery also leaves quite a bit to be desired, especially on the outro of the song. The next track, Crown, is one of the most boring moments on the record. I will say that it is a fairly different sound for Kendrick, as it's basically a guitar and piano-oriented ballad, but there is just nothing fucking happening on this song. The instrumental stays on this very repeated segment throughout most of the track's runtime, and Kendrick's vocals also aren't the most inspired or passionate thing out there. Ironically, the "Can't Please Everybody" line on this song is kind of counteracted by the rest of the record, because it does sound like he's trying to have something for everybody on this project, which is why sometimes this album can sound like it's having an identity crisis. I do like how he is trying to sort of shed his savior complex on this song, as he's realizing that he's one man, he can't do everything. But the instrumental just doesn't really inspire me to listen all that closely, to be honest. Silent Hill is probably the worst song on the record overall, with Kendrick kind of doing his best Cardi impression to some not great results. The little "who" lines are very corny and feel very out of place compared to the more serious instrumentals and topics that it's interweaved between. The beat is also very bland and lifeless, which doesn't help things either. Lyrically, these topics have already been touched on with previous songs on the project, and Kodak Black doesn't really add anything to the track that saves it in any meaningful way. It's just a track that sounds like it has as much inspiration as the actual Silent Hill franchise these days, unfortunately. The Savior interlude actually has quite a bit of meat to it, I think, with a very orchestral-driven instrumental and Baby Keem essentially recounting his childhood and just life in general. His vocal cadence works strangely well here, I have to say, and I also really like how he can switch up feeling very enthusiastic about his life and that of his friends, while also getting very introspective and sentimental as well. Savior is a really interesting and experimental beat with its buzzing bass lines, ominous piano, and very glitchy sounding drums. It almost sounds like Kendrick is having a panic attack as he's feeling like he has to shoulder the weight and burden of so many people's struggles. It also talks about the hypocrisy of religion, which is another major theme on this project. The line, "See a Christian say the vaccine is the mark of the beast, then he caught COVID and prayed to Pfizer for relief," is fantastic. It also feels like he is shedding his savior complex for good here, as he's essentially opening up and saying you won't agree with everything he says, and that's okay. He is speaking for himself now. Now, we get to the most controversial song of them all, Auntie Diaries, and to be honest, I think it's a success. The beat, I think, is one of the strongest parts of this song personally, with its very distorted and melancholic-driven instrumental, but it also rises and becomes this orchestral grand outro that goes hand in hand with Kendrick realizing his past bigotry and how he essentially sticks up for one of his family members at church. The song largely deals with two people, Kendrick's uncle and his cousin, who are both transgender, and how throughout Kendrick's life he was only exposed to both transphobia and homophobia in his community. Both Kendrick and everyone around him would use slurs casually, especially the F slur. It was just normalized around him, but the song details his progression in realizing how much those words hurt the people around him, especially as he finds out that both his cousin and his uncle are transgender. This changed his perspective and made Kendrick realize how much his actions have hurt people. Kendrick also recounts how his cousin was singled out in church by the pastor, basically saying how she was engaging in these unholy acts, when Kendrick actually says that she was the most faithful and kind out of all of them there. Kendrick standing up to the pastor in defense of his cousin is basically the climax of the song, and this also comes right before Kendrick's cousin offers Kendrick a perspective on the whole issue surrounding these words. This was when he invited a white fan up on stage to sing a song with him, but the white fan used the N-word because it was in the song. This made Kendrick uncomfortable, but as his cousin points out, this is the same scenario. This is what made Kendrick realize that his past words, his actions, they were bigoted and wrong, and this was his realization. The use of slurs and dead naming in the song is probably the most polarizing aspect of it, as he does not censor himself here. I would actually say that him not using these words would actively take away from the impact of the song, as the whole track is about him describing his growth and progression in vivid detail. When he's using the slurs and wrong pronouns, he's speaking from the perspective of his past, younger, bigoted self. But as the song progresses, he starts using the pronouns correctly, the right pronouns. He stops using the slurs other than when he's quoting his cousin at the end of the track. I like to think of it as making a movie or a book about the antebellum South. You can make it without having the white characters say the N-word. But in doing so, when you don't have them do it, you sort of glamorize the topic. You fail to fully capture how vile these viewpoints and people were and how racist they were. It also fails to capture the nature of the time period as well. At the end of the day, I think people need to ask themselves, would they rather have an ally who tiptoes around and sugarcoats a topic, and in the process doesn't have a very deep or full understanding of it? Or would you rather have an ally who is slightly problematic but real and raw with their experiences and growth as a person? And in addition to that, have a real and raw experience with the topic at hand as well. I'm not saying you can't be offended by it, of course. I'm not saying you have to think it's right. You can absolutely disagree with Kendrick's approach here. But I am mostly explaining the other side of it and the side that I think Kendrick was going for. The next track, Mr. Morale, is kind of weird coming after Auntie Diaries, to be honest. I don't hate it, but it doesn't really fit in narratively at this point in the track list, I think. I do like the ominous and moody production with the vocal samples and pulsing bass, though. It does tend to stay in one place, not really changing at all throughout the track's runtime, but I do like the lyrics about generational trauma, even if they weren't the most thorough. The structure of this song in general just feels like missed potential, I think. Mother I Sober is an excellent and somber tune that leads us into the last few moments of the project. Kendrick's vocals are subtle and haunting, feeling very drained and melancholic over a very simple piano instrumental. The chorus, sung by Beth Gibbons of Portishead, is also very haunting, and it also showcases the darkest moments of Kendrick's therapy session with the lines, "I wish I was somebody, anybody but myself." The song deals with Kendrick seeing his mother deal with sexual abuse and how this translates into many things that Kendrick sees in his adult life and this sort of toxic sex culture that he sees in his community. It's like how all this trauma from childhood essentially leads to a community with no safe spaces as adults. He relates the scenario to how he cheated on his then fiance, and after he did it, he instantly thought back to his mother and how his actions weren't that different from the man who did that to her. The samples that come in at the end are powerful and showcase how he's essentially breaking a generational curse. Mirror is the last track on the album, and it is a good one. The beat on this one is smooth and feels like a culmination of all the different experiences on the record, with its subtle synth and very bubbly bass. It's a bit more of a groove compared to the past few more melancholic and somber tracks, but I think it fits well here as it's a sort of victory lap, a light at the end of the tunnel. Kendrick's vocals are pretty lively in comparison to showcase that change, and Kendrick almost sounds emotionally rejuvenated when he's delivering the line of "I choose me, I'm sorry" as those strings hit. Kendrick made it out a better man, realizing his limits and focusing on what he can do. Now, this is going to be a pretty divisive record in his discography, despite having many different sounds that should appeal to everybody. Overall, I really like the narrative on here, and I feel like it's one of this album's strongest points. Rejecting many of the grand notions and observations of society at large, like he explored with Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly, this album focuses on Kendrick specifically. This is a therapy session about healing himself and acknowledging his pain and generational trauma, and he uses this to propel himself forward and become a better person. In this record, we actually see many different facets of Kendrick that are problematic and stuff that we might not want to hear. However, this album is about his growth, how he's changing. While many would like this process to be instantaneous, it's not. It's slow and methodical, and I think Kendrick proves that here. Despite all of these good aspects, though, I do find this album to be instrumentally a bit hit or miss. The jazzy and experimental instrumentals are lush and intricate, but the trap-oriented ones stick out in kind of a lazy and bland way, and oftentimes lack the power needed to fully support the lyrics. The track listing, because of this, ends up feeling kind of bloated. We could have trimmed this album down to like 12 or 13 songs, leaving in the very lush and vibrant instrumentals and in-depth details about his life and his growth, and leaving out the songs that retread ground lyrically or have more basic and bland instrumentals and beats. All in all, it's definitely an ambitious project. However, I find the songs to be a bit better as standalone tracks than when they're combined together like this, as the narrative becomes kind of lost and muddied after a while. It just feels like it's meandering around at points. Because of all this, I'm feeling a strong 7 on Kendrick Lamar's newest album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. Of course, we do have to talk about album covers on this show, and I think this is a pretty great album cover, honestly. The colors are an immediate highlight, I think. It's all warm, very lush, and kind of intimate as well. This matches the imagery, too, as it's depicting, Kendrick's home life. He also has the crown of thorns on his head to sort of encapsulate his savior complex. I just think the composition of this album cover is really good. It matches a lot of the themes on the project and sums up what you'll be getting into. But of course, those are just my thoughts on this newest album by Kendrick Lamar. What did you guys think? Do you think this is his latest masterpiece, or was there room for improvement, maybe a little too long, maybe a little too meandering? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell to see more from me, and until the next one, farewell.